Technical difficulties, comma, I'm back on, period. Okay, how's everybody doing? I am so sorry. I had difficulties getting in this morning. I do apologize for that, knucklehead. I forgot to hit start the broadcast. I can't believe I did something that crazy. If you're in the audience, go ahead and type me in a quick hello this morning to let me know you're here. Angelina, I see you're here. I see we've had a couple of people. I am sorry. For those of you who are new, I promise you this does not happen often. This is just me making a typical Roddenberry mistake. I do this a lot of times, so you'll just have to forgive me. Let me go ahead and see what we got going on here. Let's see. Are we live? Are we live on October? Yes, we are. Thank goodness. Holy cow, boy. That was difficult. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with the lecture. I do apologize for anybody who was lost today. Angelina, let's go ahead and get started. So, one of the things that I do want to talk about in this particular class is human sexuality. One of the things that you're going to see is there's a huge cultural divide that exists here in America today concerning the nature of human sexuality. This divide has led to upheaval across political, judicial, and religious spheres of influence in our society. Everybody's arguing about what it means to be a male or a female. And there are so many contentious policy debates in this country right now that are sort of tearing us apart. You know what I mean? People are arguing about whether or not we should have books that represent people from the LGBTQ. We're arguing about sexual reassignment interventions for children, public bathrooms. There are all these public debates. I am going to try to avoid those all today. Instead, is what I want to do is give you a few facts so that you'll understand the difference you'll understand the arguments that are being made just a little bit better, at least in my opinion. Now, one of the things that I want to do today is I do not want to try to give you an opinion about how you should feel about what happens in bathrooms, what happens in schools, or what happens in doctors' offices. It is not my job to tell you how to feel about any of these social policy issues. We're not doing that here today. Instead, all I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about the process of sexual development that occurs across the human lifespan. Think of this as a developmental psychology class where we're going to talk about development of sexuality for the next hour. So here we go. Remember, I'm not trying to persuade you one way or the other. I'm just trying to give you the facts as I see them. Okay, now, some people are going to argue that there are two sexes, and other people are going to say, "Oh, sex is a very fluid concept, and there are more than just two sexes." And some people say, "Nope, you're either an X chromosome or you're a Y chromosome." Other people say, "No, you just don't understand them." How you answer that question depends upon what you look at when it comes to sexuality. All right, now. The people who are saying there are only two sexes, these people are talking about genetically. Genetically speaking, there are only two sexes. Either you have the SRY gene, which only comes on a Y chromosome, or you don't have that. If you have the SRY gene on the Y chromosome, and I shouldn't have said always on the Y chromosome because there are mutations when it comes on the X chromosome, and these lead to different biological outcomes. But either you have a Y chromosome or you do not have a Y chromosome. Genes, little embryos that have the SRY gene will begin to transform into, oh my goodness, embryos with the SRY gene will begin to transform into males around the 7th week of gestation. Embryos without the SRY gene will begin to transform into females about the 7th week of gestation. So either you have the X chromosome or you don't. Either you have the Y chromosome or you don't have the Y chromosome. These occur in the 23rd pair of chromosomes called the sex chromosomes. Remember, you can have either an XX or an XY, typically. And the XYs tend to become males and the X's tend to become females. Now, if you're talking to people who say there are only two sexes, they're focusing on what we'll call genetic sex. And they are right. On the other hand, there are going to be some people who argue that there are more than two sexes, that there are variations in adult sexuality. You know what? These people are also right too, because what they're talking about is your phenotype, which is what you actually turn out to look like, rather than your genotype, which is your set of instructions. A set of genes is only a set of instructions for building a human being. Look at that complex person that's sitting in front of me. You developed from one single fertilized egg cell. That process is incredibly complicated and occurs as a result of the genetic instructions that are provided in your genotype, okay? So yes, you do have these instructions that are telling you to develop as a prototypical or a prototypical female. However, you folks all know that we have chromosomal changes, we have genetic mutations, and then the environment plays a part as we develop these full phenotypes that represent our genotypic instructions. So your genotype is a blueprint for building and running your body. This includes 25,000 genes that must work together in the proper order and at the proper time in order to make and create and regulate the proteins that are going to be you. Genes are turned on and turned off in genetically predetermined patterns. Your phenotype is what you actually turn out to be. And your genotype may be affected by your culture, beliefs, epigenetic effects. Sometimes in the environment will cause genes to turn on and off. And then there are developmental abnormalities. And so all of your genetic instructions create this complex thing called a human being. Now, this human being represents a biological sex. A human being is going to have both primary sex characteristics and secondary sex characteristics. What are the primary sex characteristics? Those are really characteristics that help you have babies. So your sex organs, your testes, and the hormones and the sex cells you have, those are your primary sex characteristics. So your sex organs and your sex cells, those are your primary sex characteristics. Now also, we develop a set of secondary sex characteristics. These are physical changes that are associated with sexual maturity. They aren't your sexual organs. They are not directly related to reproduction. However, some of these changes create what we see as the mature male and the mature female. Irregardless of their genetic instructions, this is what you wind up turning out to look like after you mature. Now, these secondary sex characteristics, some of them are universal, so males and females are going to all develop all going to develop pubic hair, but then you're going to have body shapes that turn males into male shapes and turn females into female shapes. Females are going to develop breasts. Your males are going to develop that extra secondary. These are known as secondary sex characteristics, okay? Now, here's the thing. You have your genetics. You either have that SRY chromosome, that is to say you are a male, or you do not have that SRY chromosome and you are genetically a female. However, over the course of your prenatal development, you are going to develop these primary and secondary sex characteristics. They're going to happen during prenatal development and through puberty, and these are going to turn you into the mature male and mature female of this species. Now, here's the deal. the genetic and chromosome changes, variations that sometimes cause people not to develop into the prototypic male and female of the species. So let's look at some of the milestones of sexual differentiation that are going to occur in the typical cisgender male and female. At the fifth week of gestation, you're going to start developing these bipotential gonads. Are these gonads ovaries or testes? We don't know at this point. They're just these gonads that are going to produce hormones that are responsible for helping you, and they're going to create your hormones and also the sex cells that are going to be used for reproduction. At the 7th week of gestation, this SRY gene in perfect situations is going to turn on, and it's going to cause these bipotential gonads to begin developing into testes. If you don't have an SRY gene, then these gonads are going to naturally begin developing into ovaries. So the weird thing is, for human beings, the natural course of development is going to be into a female, unless you have this genetically determined response at the 7th week of gestation. So all organisms, male and female, have the same sex organs, but those organs begin to turn into male organs at the 7th, male or female organs at the 7th week of gestation. Now, shortly thereafter, these developing sex glands are going to start producing sex hormones. Now, if you begin to develop testes, these testes are going to start producing more testosterone. Now, these organs are going to produce both male and female hormones, testosterone and estrogen. But what you're going to find is these testes are going to begin making much more testosterone than estrogen. And if you have ovaries, they're going to make more estrogen than they are going to make testosterone. And so what's going to happen is this testosterone coursing through this prenatal developing baby's system is going to cause a cascade of changes that change this little developing zygote embryo into a male. And on the other hand, if there is no SRY gene and these gonads start developing into ovaries, they're going to start creating estrogen. And this estrogen is going to start flowing through the body of this little developing embryo at 8 weeks and begin to turn it into a female, right? And during the 16th week of gestation, you're going to start developing either the little vagina or the penis that is going to be representative of your sex. All right. And so this is sort of what happens prenatally. All right. So your baby's going to be born with some gonads. There's gonads are going to be, a switch is going to be flipped in your 23rd pair of chromosomes, and it's going to turn these gonads either into ovaries or testes. They're going to start producing the sex hormones that are going to cause the development of these other primary sex characteristics. Now, the second thing you're going to see is that around the age of 8 or 9 years, this is when this sexuality kicks in and you do the final bit of sexual development. Puberty begins. All people produce testosterones or androgens and estrogens, estriadiol and other estrogens. But biological males produce much more androgens than estrogens, and women produce much more estrogens than androgens. If you look underneath me, you'll see sort of the pattern of this hormone production in early childhood. What you're going to see is about the age of 10, these two hormones, the production of these two hormones is going to skyrocket. Testosterone for males and estrogen for females. And this is what's going to cause the secondary sex characteristics to begin developing. Okay? Let's see. Now, here's the deal. Here's what I want you to understand. Biological sex is not as simple as genetic sex. Okay? Now, you do have these genes, but there is a long, complex process of sexual differentiation that occurs as you are maturing. Okay? And Just like every other genetic trait we have, there are mutations, genetic variations that cause this not to happen in a normative manner. Variation and change is built into the systems. You know, genetic variation is what allows us to evolve and grow as a species. So you've got to expect that there's going to be variations between what your genetics instructions say and what your final maturity comes out to be. All right. Now, what I'm going to talk about just briefly today, I don't want to get into the whole complex process of what could happen, but I do want to make you aware that there are some chromosome and genetic variations that cause people to develop into non-normative variations of what we expect to be the cisgender male and the cisgender female. All right. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but there are some chromosomal abnormalities that occur on the 23rd pair of genes. Have you folks ever heard of Klinefelter syndrome? This is when we have a genetic male who will accidentally have a third chromosome in the 23rd pair. Now, I know you folks have heard of trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. Sometimes people have a third chromosome in their 21st pair. You can have 47 chromosomes. When that happens in the 23rd pair and you get an extra X chromosome, you get what's known as Klinefelter syndrome. And this is a male who will have all the primary male sex characteristics, but a lot of times they won't, they'll grow up to be sterile, so they may not be producing working sperm, and they're going to develop some secondary female characteristics, slight secondary female characteristics. They may get more of a female shape than a male shape. You may see a guy that has a lot of fat on his chest that kind of looks like breasts. And here's the crazy thing. This change, these effects are so subtle that there are a lot of men with Klinefelter syndrome who don't notice it until they get tested as adults because they're married and for some reason their spouse and they are having problems having a baby, conceiving a baby. They'll go and start doing they'll go to the doctor's office and they'll find out that they actually had Klinefelter syndrome and they hadn't known their entire life, right? And so this is a genetic male who, by virtue of having this extra X chromosome, develops some female secondary sex characteristics. Now, there are some males who have an extra Y chromosome in the 23rd pair, okay? And so this is a genetic male, and these genetic males grow super duper tall. They still produce testosterone, but they seem to grow exceedingly tall. Now, the crazy thing is, back in the day, people used to think that the Y chromosome was aggressive. So it was thought that men with XYY disorder would be criminals. It turns out that having an extra Y chromosome does not make you any more likely to act out or get into legal trouble. But there are some men who are born with 2 Y chromosomes. I don't know if you know this, but there are some females that are born with only 45 chromosomes. They don't have that 46th YX chromosome. So with Turner syndrome, you're going to have a genetic female. See, she's only got 1 sex chromosome in X. Since there's no Y, this person is genetically a female. However, this genetic female is going to is not going to have that extra X chromosome. They're typically going to be infertile. Typically, women with Turner syndrome are shorter than 5 foot. You're going to get those 4'7", 4'8" high ladies. And a lot of times they're actually going to have learning disorders in school. So that's Turner syndrome. So some people can only be born with 1 X chromosome and no supporting chromosome in the 23rd pair. Swyer syndrome. Here's the crazy thing. Sometimes the X chromosome will have the SRY gene. So remember, I talked to you about the SRY gene. Most of the time, it's on the Y chromosome, and that causes you to develop the normal genetic male. Well, what you're going to have is that that SRY gene is going to somehow get switched over to the X chromosome, and cause infertility in a genetic male. So you're going to get a genetic male, but the SRY gene is going to be in the wrong place, which is going to cause a cascade of abnormal development as well, right? And occasionally even, you will get a female with two X chromosomes that has the SRY gene on the two X chromosomes. Now, you might say this is a genetically female person, but this person has that genetic SRY gene. So this is actually a weird situation where you might say it's a genetic female and a genetic male at the same time. So what I want you to know is that your instructions that turn you from a genetic male into a mature male, and your instructions that turn you from a genetic female into a mature genetic female, sometimes it's not even that simple because the genes and chromosomes are a little bit different. Now, the weird thing is, not only do you have to have these chromosomes, and these chromosomes have to cause a change, but then you have to have a cascade of changes that allow these genes to work properly. Now, sometimes you have genetic females that are, for some reason or another, their body is going to make too much testosterone in utero. And you're going to get a genetic female, but this genetic female is going to get the muscle growth and the strength and have the testosterone levels that are going to be more similar to a male than a female. So you're going to have a genetic female, but her testosterone levels are going to be indicative of a male. On the other hand, sometimes we have genetic males, XY, but the weird thing is their body has some sort of genetic mutation where the cells of the developing fetus don't respond to the testosterone that's being released by the testes. So you're going to have an XY, a genetic male, whose body doesn't develop the secondary male characteristics because his body is insensitive to the testosterone that's being released. All right? So the weird thing is you can have these genetic instructions, but these instructions are only there at conception, and they tell you what to build. But the building process is very, very complex and requires a cascade of changes that happen in the right order at the right time. And sometimes this doesn't happen. All right? And so what we're going to get are a case where, you know what, there are only two genetic sexes, male and female. This is true. However, there are great variations. There are great variations in how people express these genetic instructions. All right. So there are going to be people who are what you might call transsexual. They're going to have both male and female primary and secondary sex characteristics. It is a thing. All right. Now, of course, the sexual characteristics that you have, primary and secondary sex characteristics that you have, are one part of the sexual process. However, where it gets even more complicated is that your genetic instructions and your mature sexual maturity is going to affect your behavior, how you behave and how you think. And these things are going to have caused even more debate and conflict in our culture. Now, not only do males develop differently based upon males and females develop primary and secondary sex characteristics, but they also develop differences in their preferences for sexual activity, right? So, of course, in the genes, in the instructions, is an instinct for sexual activity. You have to have the drive for sexual activity. If you don't have that drive for sexual activity, then your organism, your species isn't going to continue on. If you remember last week when we talked about motivation and emotion in chapter 9, I talked to you about needs-based theories of sexuality. And we talked about Sigmund Freud and the fact that the instinct for sex is built into the system. So that's also a part of this genetic and developmental process. And so this process may not develop in that prototypical binary heterosexual manner that some people expect, right? So your sexual orientations, and so we talk about your sexual makeup. Now, this is your sexual orientation, and this is the nature of your enduring sexual, emotional, and attraction to other people. This is different from gender identity, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And I do want you to know that there's been a long battle for acceptance of non-conforming sexual orientations here in the United States. I don't know if you knew this, but it was actually against the law to be homosexual in the United States up until the 1960s. I don't know if you knew this, but until 1973, homosexuality was actually considered mental illness by the psychological community. Now, both of those things have changed for the better, in my opinion. For the better, in my opinion. However, there are people who have different preferences. Some people, what we call homosexual, their sexual preferences is for people that have the same sexual, secondary sexual characteristics as themselves. There are some people who are bisexual and feel sexually attracted to both males and females. So we have all different variations in these patterns of behavior. Now, what causes people? One of the big thoughts in areas of debate in society about homosexuality is what causes it. Conservatives a lot of time are going to act as if there are some people, social conservatives, who are going to act as if the environment is the most important part for creating your sexual preferences. I'm going to tell you that the evidence does not seem to suggest this idea that one learns their sexual preference. Now, the environmental factors associated with sexual orientation. Being raised by homosexual parents does not increase the likelihood of being homosexual. This is not an opinion. The data support this contention. Now, what you will see is that there is gender non-conforming behavior as a child. So what you're going to see is that very early in life, your males that turn out to be homosexual males will begin to exhibit female characteristics and behaviors and preferences early in life. And for your females that may grow up to be homosexual, they may demonstrate preferences that are prototypically male early in life. So you're going to see this gender non-conforming behavior very early in life. However, this is correlational, not causational. So this is not to say that making your little boy play with dolls or making your little girl play with trucks is going to affect their sexuality. Just doesn't happen that way. Now, there do appear to be some biological factors that are associated with sexual orientation. Homosexuality appears to have a genetic link. The weird thing is, what you're going to notice is that there's a stronger genetic link for homosexuality for males than there is for females. Male sexuality appears to be more channeled and more genetically determined than female sexuality. Now, we do know that exposure to hormones, that prenatal exposure to hormones is associated with the development of homosexuality. Specifically, there's research linking prenatal exposure to androgens like testosterone and lesbianism, and being a lesbian. The weird thing is, they think that there may be something that has to do with the maternal immune system that affects the development of sexuality. Because the crazy thing is, males with older brothers have a higher likelihood of being gay. Now, I will tell you that this is not determined. If you have an older brother, this does not mean that you as a male are going to be gay. I have 5 older brothers, and I will tell you that I am quite heterosexual. But there is a higher incidence of homosexuality for males who have older brothers. And we do know this is not causal. We don't know if this is causal, but if you do brain scans, what you're going to notice is that the hypothalamus, if you remember that from last week when I was talking about motivated behavior, remember your hypothalamus controls your motivated behavior? What you're going to notice is that the hypothalamus appears to be bigger in males, heterosexual males, than in the other groups. So hypothalamus size. So there are some sort of brain changes that you'll see between males and females, in between heterosexual males and non-heterosexual males. Now, final notes. Not all people's sexual preference is limited to one sex. So we have, not only do we have heterosexuals, not only do we have homosexuals, but there are people who are bisexual as well. As I suggested to you, there's a stronger genetic link for males than for females. There appears to be a little more sexual fluidity for females than for males. And when we think about sexual preference, as we think about sexuality, the expression of sexual characteristics, think of sexual preference as existing on a continuum, just like sexuality exists. We have some people that have primary sex, male and female sex characteristics, and secondary female and male characteristics. Think about sexual orientation and sexual preference as existing on this continuum as well. Again, for those of you who think otherwise, I promise you, there are, genetically speaking, there are either people with the SRY gene and people without the SRY gene. Yes, there are only 2, males and females. But when it comes to the expression of mature sexuality, there are more than 2 categories. Okay, so let's see. I skipped over a couple of slides. I don't like the way this is organized. All right, now, even more controversial is this idea of gender identity, And now this is different. So we have biological sex where you actually show characteristics. That's controversial. We have sexual preference where people show preference for one or the other sex for sexual activity. Now, what's even more complex is that people feel their sexuality as well. They don't just have sexual preferences. Their bodies don't just look a certain way. But the final piece of the puzzle in being either a male or female is feeling your sex. And that's your gender identity. And this is where it gets most controversial and where people make the jokes about identifying as a male, identifying as a female. Now, I don't know for sure. I absolutely don't know for sure. I am a cisgender male. I've grown up male. I have male secondary and primary sex characteristics, and I feel like a male. However, there are people who say that they feel a way that is different from what their body says. I happen to believe that this is true, but this is just my opinion. But what I know is not opinion is that people's feelings of being one sex or the other is a part of your mature sexuality. Not only do I have primary sex characteristics, not only do I have physical sex characteristics, not only do I feel my sex in terms of who I want to have sex with, but I feel my sex and whether or not I tend to think of myself as being a male or a female. Most people's gender identity matches their biological sex, but this appears not to be true for all people. Sometimes people's sex characteristics and their gender identity do not match. Now, I had to learn these terms quite late in my life, probably 5 or 6 years ago. I didn't know what it meant to be cisgender. I had a student write to me and tell me that they were cisgender, and I was embarrassed that I did not know. That's when your sex and your gender identity mix. However, there are some people who say that their sex, their biological sex, and their identity don't mix. These people call themselves transgender. So they may look like a male, but they don't feel like a male. They may look like a male, but they may look like a female, but they look like a male. Right? Now, there are some people that don't really have a strong feeling of being a male or a female either way. These people, and they just don't have a feeling of being a sex. We sometimes, there's a label, they call these people gender queer, and then there are some people who feel male and feel female, and they call themselves androgynous. Now, while being transgender is not a psychological disorder, there are some transgender people that do suffer distress because their gender identity doesn't match their biological sex. Now, being anything is not a problem. Being heterosexual is not a problem. Being homosexual is not a problem. However, if being heterosexual causes you to do things that make you distressed, that hurt you, that make you feel bad, then your sexuality is a problem. Being homosexual is not a problem. However, if your sexuality makes you do things that homosexuality makes you do things that cause you to feel bad, then you have a problem. Being male and female is not a problem. Being male and feeling like you're a female is not a problem. However, because of the way our society responds to people whose biological sex and gender identity don't match up, because society has such a problem, there are people who are transgender who have psychological problems. Not because they're transgender, but because of the way society accepts their situation. Okay, so do know that being transgender is not a psychological disorder. However, if you grow up in a world that is not nice to you, it can create problems. Okay, now brain scans do seem to show, I will say, I can't tell you for true, I can't point to any evidence that would say that gender identity doesn't always match biological predisposition. I have to say, I'm not sure if the data necessarily supports that. However, there are brain scans that show that the activity of transgender people does seem to match the brain of their gender. So, if you show the transgender male thing, what you can do is you can look at the transgender male's brain activity and it will look more similar to a cisgender female's brain activity. A transgender female's brain activity will look more similar to a male's activity than it will to a female's activity. So brain scans does seem to suggest that this is a real thing. But like I said, and it is not a problem unless it creates anxiety and problems. And as I suggested down here, gender dysphoria is a disorder characterized by distress regarding the inconsistency. Like I said, it's not a problem to be inconsistent. It's a problem when it causes you anxiety. When we get to chapter 14 and chapter 15, we're going to talk about the characteristics of psychological disorders and any behavioral syndrome that causes you great distress, anything that causes you problems in your mind is a psychological disorder. So being transgender or genderqueer or androgynous itself is not a problem. However, If it causes you distress in your life, then it becomes a problem. So there's a difference between having being transgender and between having gender dysphoria. Now, excuse me. One of the things I really feel strongly about, that I do know is true, is that we do an awful lot in our society, acculturating people to be one gender or the other. If you remember from chapter 7, I talked about schemas, and a schema is just a set of associations you have with any concept. Typically, I think in class I talk about circus. And Angelina, I think I asked you to tell me some things in your mind that popped into your mind when I said circus, and you had several terms that came right out. Gender is also a schema as well. You learn, number one, what males do and what females do. You learn the gender schema of males and females, and then you learn what you are as a male or a female. You learn your own self-gender schema, if you will. And gender schemas typically divide the world into two categories, males and females. And this starts so early. Did you know by the age of 6 months, infants already associate high-pitched voices with being female and low-pitched voices with being males. Now, gender schemas are great because schemas are shortcuts that help us process and make sense of the world together. And just like we have schemas for everything, we have gender schemas or what you might call gender stereotypes, beliefs about what males and what females do. And these are okay as long as they help us. But sometimes when people's behavior or activities or preferences violate these schemas, we tend to punish them. And that's where I think gender schemas have a problem. I think it's completely cool to be a male and to think like a male, and I'm glad that I have male thoughts. But if I'm the kind of person that judges people because their thoughts don't match mine, then, in my opinion, it becomes problematic. Now, we very early in life begin socializing our children to follow gender roles. Okay, and gender role socialization is that process of enculturating someone to have the beliefs that fit with the sex you believe they to be. How do we learn these? Well, we learn these by watching other people, and we copy these other people, and then our moms and our dads and our friends actually reinforce our behavior when we behave consistently with our gender beliefs. Did you know that starting around the age 4, 5, and 6, kids are really going to separate themselves out into groups of boys and groups of girls? And any boy that decides to play with the girls is going to get punished by his friends. They're not going to play with him. Any girl that violates her girl group and goes over and plays with the boys is going to be shunned by her group. So we really begin to reinforce these gender roles. We begin to see them early in our life. We observe them and we model these behaviors. And then we're punished if we don't act in a manner that is consistent with our given gender role. Now, gender roles are not universal or not eternal. As I say here, gender roles are changing. And although you folks may think, oh my God, this world is so sexist now, you really don't understand how it used to be. When I grew up in the 70s and 80s, things were really divided, and men had to be men and women had to be women, and men made more money and you women would shut up and sit down and listen to us talk. Things have completely changed now. So gender role expectations are changing and becoming more egalitarian. And actually, if you look down here, what you're going to notice is that attitudes since 1977, when I was an 8-year-old boy, have changed and become more egalitarian recently. But there are still beliefs about what males should think and believe and what females should think and believe. And that's why I think that people have such a big problem with transgenders. Okay, I think, let's see, yep, that's it. Excuse me, I'm having trouble with my buttons today. Thank you very much for coming. I see that we had 3 people here in lecture today. We are not going to lecture on Thursday. There is only one sexuality lecture for chapter 10. The second half of the chapter covers sexual activity and stuff that I think is frankly more appropriate for a biology class than a psychology class. The only reason I like to talk about this chapter 12 is kind of weird, chapter 10, sexuality, in my opinion, is kind of weird in a psychology textbook. I think it's more of a biology chapter concept. However, I do like to talk about transsexual, transgender, and gender identity in this class. But we're only having one lecture this week, so there is no lecture on Thursday, okay? Does anyone have any questions before I cancel the lecture? I typically, if you're a new student in this class and this is your first time here, I apologize for going over the 50-minute period because I only had one lecture this week. I went a little bit longer. Angelina, I hope this lecture made some sense. I'm always very uptight and anxious about talking about sexuality, and so sometimes it goes better than other times. Hey, no webinar this week. You do have to finish up your discussion boards by Thursday night. If you have any questions, send me a text. Otherwise, I'm going to close the lecture for today. Take care. And, oh, yeah, it went well. You're nice. I know it didn't, Angelina, but you're so nice for saying that. Thanks. Y'all have a great day, and I will see you next Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. Take care.